You're not lost. That's the first thing that needs to be said clearly, without motivation, without encouragement, and without optimism layered on top. Lost implies confusion. Lost implies you don't know where to go. That's not what's happening. You know more than you admit. Most people who feel lost are not missing information. They're surrounded by it. They've listened to the podcasts. They've read the books. They've thought about their life late at night when everything is quiet and honest. They've had moments where the truth surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Those moments usually come when you're alone, when there's no one to impress, when you're not distracted, when the excuses lose their power for a second. In those moments, you don't feel lost, you feel aware. And awareness is uncomfortable because awareness comes with responsibility. If you truly didn't know what to do, there would be no pressure. But pressure exists because something inside you already understands what's misaligned. That understanding is what you keep calling confusion. Confusion is often just clarity you don't want to act on yet. People say they're lost because it feels gentler than saying they're avoiding something specific. Lost sounds temporary. Avoiding sounds deliberate. Most people would rather feel temporarily confused than permanently responsible. So they stay in that space. They delay. They gather more information. They think a little longer. And time passes quietly. Being lost becomes a safe identity. It allows you to stay where you are without admitting that you're choosing it. That's the uncomfortable part. You don't wake up one day and decide to avoid your life. You do it slowly. You do it by telling yourself there's more time, by saying you'll decide later, by keeping everything just open enough that nothing has to change today. That openness feels like freedom, but it's actually hesitation disguised as flexibility. And hesitation has a cost. The longer you avoid choosing, the heavier the decision becomes. Not because the decision changes, but because you do. You accumulate more responsibility, more attachment, more reasons not to disrupt things. What felt possible 5 years ago feels risky now. Not because you're weaker, because your life has more weight. This is why people feel more lost as time goes on. They're not losing direction. They're losing courage to act on what they already know. That loss doesn't happen all at once. It happens in quiet compromises. You stay somewhere that drains you a little longer than you should. You say yes when you should say no. You keep waiting for a clearer sign. But clarity rarely arrives with fireworks. It arrives as a quiet knowing you keep pushing aside. This is why the idea of being lost is comforting. It removes urgency. It tells you nothing can be done until something changes externally. But the truth is simpler and harder. You're not lost. You're standing in front of a decision you don't want to make yet. And as long as you keep calling it confusion, you don't have to face what choosing would cost you. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about why confusion feels real, even when it isn't, and how avoidance disguises itself as overthinking. Chapter 2. Confusion is usually avoidance. Confusion feels real. That's why it works. When you're confused, you feel justified in waiting. You feel reasonable for not acting yet. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful, careful, responsible. Confusion buys you time, and time feels harmless. But most confusion isn't about not knowing what to do. It's about not wanting to accept what you already know. People who are truly confused ask questions and move forward as they learn. Their confusion resolves itself through action. The confusion that lingers is different. It circles. You think about the same things again and again. You replay the same possibilities. You imagine different outcomes. You weigh pros and cons you've already weighed before. Nothing new enters the picture. That's not confusion. That's avoidance wearing a smarter mask. Avoidance doesn't announce itself as fear. It presents itself as thoughtfulness. It tells you you're being patient. It tells you you're waiting for clarity. But clarity rarely comes from thinking longer. It comes from deciding. Most people are not confused about what matters to them. They're confused about what they're willing to give up to get it. That's the real conflict. Because every real decision closes doors. It commits you to one direction and eliminates others. It forces you to accept loss alongside progress. And loss is uncomfortable. So instead of choosing, people stay confused. They say things like, I just don't know what I want yet, even though they know what they don't want. They know what drains them. They know what feels wrong. They know what they're avoiding thinking about late at night. But knowing what you don't want still requires a choice, and choice creates consequences. So confusion becomes a place to hide. Now let's talk about overthinking. Overthinking is not intelligence. It's hesitation repeating itself. You're not processing new information. You're revisiting old conclusions without accepting them. This creates mental noise. The noise feels busy. It feels active. It feels productive, but nothing moves. Overthinking keeps you stuck in your head where nothing can change you. Action, even imperfect action, forces clarity. Overthinking postpones it. This is why people can feel mentally exhausted while physically unchanged. They've been wrestling with the same decision for years. Now let's talk about why avoidance feels safer than choosing. Choosing means admitting that your current life is partly the result of your own decisions. That realization can feel heavy. It's easier to believe you're confused than to accept responsibility for direction. Confusion keeps the story open. Responsibility closes it. This is especially hard for people who see themselves as thoughtful, careful, or intelligent. They don't want to act prematurely. They want to be sure. But certainty is rare. Most meaningful decisions are made with incomplete information. People who move forward are not more certain. They're more willing to accept uncertainty. Now let's talk about the emotional cost of staying confused. At first, confusion feels neutral. Then it becomes frustrating. Then it becomes tiring. Then it becomes part of your identity. You start saying things like, I'm just someone who overthinks, or I need more time than other people. That identity protects the pattern. It allows confusion to persist without challenge. Eventually, confusion becomes a lifestyle. You delay decisions across multiple areas of your life: career, relationships, money, location. You tell yourself you'll decide later. Later becomes vague. Vague becomes permanent. And suddenly years have passed. This is how people wake up one day feeling behind without knowing when it happened. They didn't fall behind. They paused too long. Now let's talk about a hard truth. Avoidance doesn't remove pressure. It postpones it. The decision you avoid today doesn't disappear. It waits. And while it waits, life continues moving. More commitments appear. More responsibilities accumulate. More people depend on you staying the same. The decision becomes heavier. This is why people say things like, I should have done this earlier. Earlier would have been easier. Not because you were more capable, but because your life was lighter. Now let's talk about honesty. If you sat quietly and asked yourself one simple question, without judgment, without pressure, you would likely know the answer. Not the full plan, not the perfect solution, but the direction. You know which decision you've been postponing. You know which conversation you've avoided. You know which boundary you haven't set. You know which choice scares you because it would make things real. That knowledge isn't confusion, it's clarity you haven't accepted yet. The moment you accept it, confusion dissolves. Not because the path becomes easy, but because the question changes. You stop asking, what should I do? You start asking, what am I willing to give up? That's where real decisions live. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about why keeping options open feels safe and how flexibility quietly turns into paralysis. Chapter 3. Why keeping options open feels safe. Keeping options open feels intelligent. It feels mature. It feels responsible. You tell yourself you're not rushing. You're giving life room to unfold. You're staying flexible so you don't make a mistake you can't undo. That story sounds reasonable, but most of the time, keeping options open isn't about flexibility. It's about fear of commitment. Commitment closes doors, and closed doors force you to live with the consequences of a choice. Keeping options open delays that moment. It allows you to imagine multiple futures without fully stepping into any of them. Imagination is comforting. Reality is demanding. So people stay in imagination longer than they should. They say things like, I don't want to limit myself, when what they really mean is, I don't want to choose wrong. But here's the part people don't like to hear. Not choosing is still a choice. It just feels safer because the consequences are slower. When you keep options open, life doesn't stop. It keeps moving without your permission. Opportunities don't wait forever, Energy doesn't stay the same. Circumstances change. And slowly, without deciding anything, your options narrow anyway. Not by intention, by time. This is the trap. People think they're preserving freedom by not choosing, but freedom doesn't come from infinite options. It comes from commitment to a direction. Now let's talk about why options feel comforting psychologically. Options give you an escape hatch. As long as nothing is finalized, you can tell yourself you're still in control. You haven't failed. You haven't committed. You haven't proven anything yet. Everything is still theoretical. The moment you choose, theory ends. Reality begins. Reality includes feedback. Feedback includes discomfort. That's why people stay flexible long past the point where flexibility helps them. They don't want feedback yet. Now let's talk about the cost of keeping options open. The cost isn't obvious at first. At first, nothing feels lost. But over time, something subtle happens. You stop developing depth. Depth only comes from staying with something long enough for it to challenge you. When you keep options open, you avoid depth. You skim life. You know a little about many things, but not enough about one thing to let it shape you. This creates a constant feeling of incompleteness. You're busy but unfulfilled, active but unsettled, involved but not invested. That unsettled feeling is often mistaken for restlessness or boredom. It's not, it's lack of commitment. Now let's talk about identity. Identity forms through commitment. When you choose something and stay with it, even when it's uncomfortable, you become someone different. You develop confidence. You build self-trust. You create momentum. When you avoid choosing, identity stays vague. You remain someone who is considering, exploring, or figuring things out. That identity feels safe, but it keeps you floating. Now let's talk about another uncomfortable truth. People who keep options open often believe they're waiting for a better option, but better options rarely appear when you're not moving. Movement creates opportunities. Commitment creates leverage. Waiting rarely does. Most people don't miss opportunities because they chose wrong. They miss opportunities because they never chose at all. Now let's talk about regret. Regret doesn't usually come from bad decisions. It comes from avoided ones. People don't look back and say, I wish I hadn't tried. They say, I wish I had committed earlier. They regret waiting. They regret staying open too long. They regret thinking instead of acting. Now let's talk about the illusion of reversibility. People keep options open because they want decisions to be reversible. They want an exit. But most meaningful decisions are not fully reversible. That's what gives them weight. That weight is uncomfortable, but it's also what creates meaning. When something costs you something else, it matters. When everything stays open, nothing feels real. Now let's talk about the fear underneath all of this. The fear is not failure. The fear is permanence. People are afraid of locking themselves into a life they can't escape, so they choose not to lock themselves into anything. Ironically, that often locks them into exactly the life they were trying to avoid. Because default paths are powerful. If you don't choose deliberately, life chooses for you. Now let's talk about the moment people sense this truth. It usually happens quietly, late at night, in still moments. When distractions are gone, they realize they've been considering the same things for years. They haven't changed. They've just aged. That realization is painful. So they push it away. They tell themselves they still have time. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't as much as they think. This is not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you up. Keeping options open feels safe, but safety without direction slowly turns into stagnation. The next chapter is where this becomes personal, because we're going to talk about the decision you don't want to make and why it's the one shaping your life the most. Chapter 4. The decision you don't want to make. There is usually one decision sitting underneath everything else. Not 10 decisions. Not a complicated plan. One. It's the decision you circle around. The one you keep revisiting. The one that quietly shapes everything, even though you rarely name it directly. You don't think about it all the time, but it shows up in how you feel. In the background frustration, in the low-level anxiety, in the sense that something is off, even when life looks fine from the outside. That feeling isn't random. It's the cost of postponement. Most people don't avoid decisions because they don't care. They avoid them because the decision would change their identity. It would require admitting something uncomfortable, that the path you're on isn't aligned, that the relationship you're maintaining is limiting you, that the role you're playing no longer fits who you are. Admitting that feels heavy, so instead of deciding, people adjust around it. They optimize the wrong situation. They cope. They manage. They make small improvements to avoid making the big choice. Those adjustments work for a while, but the underlying tension remains. Now let's talk about why this one decision is so powerful. Because it's usually irreversible in some meaningful way. Not completely, but enough to feel final. It might mean disappointing someone. It might mean letting go of security. It might mean accepting uncertainty. It might mean admitting you waited too long. That last one is the hardest because people don't just fear the future. They fear confronting the past. They fear realizing that they've been complicit in their own stagnation. So they delay. They say things like, I just need a little more time, or I'll know when it's right. But the truth is, you already know, not in detail, but in direction. You know which decision would make things real. That's the one you don't want to make yet. Now let's talk about the emotional weight of deciding. People imagine that once they decide, they'll feel relief. Sometimes they do, but often the first feeling is grief. Grief for the version of life that will no longer be possible. Every real decision involves loss, even good ones. Choosing one direction means releasing others, and release feels like loss, even when what you're gaining is better. Most people don't talk about this part. They talk about clarity and confidence. They don't talk about mourning the paths you don't take. But that mourning is necessary. If you don't allow it, you'll keep one foot in the past. You'll second guess. You'll hesitate. You'll reopen doors that needed to close. Now let's talk about how avoidance shows up day to day. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like distraction. You stay busy. You fill your schedule. You keep moving. Movement without direction feels productive, but it's often just avoidance in motion. People who avoid one big decision often become experts at small ones. They fine-tune routines. They tweak habits. They optimize efficiency. All of it keeps them from confronting the core choice. That's why progress can feel exhausting without being fulfilling. You're doing a lot, just not the thing that matters. Now let's talk about fear again. The fear is not that the decision will fail. The fear is that it will work. If it works, you can't pretend anymore. You can't go back to the old story. You can't blame circumstances. You'll have to live with the consequences of choosing. That's real responsibility, and responsibility feels heavy before it feels empowering. Now let's talk about timing. People wait for the right time to decide. But the right time is rarely about circumstances. It's about tolerance. Tolerance for discomfort, tolerance for uncertainty, tolerance for temporary instability. When tolerance is low, every decision feels too risky. When tolerance increases, decisions become possible. Tolerance increases through experience, which means waiting doesn't make deciding easier. Acting does. Now let's talk about the cost of not deciding. This cost doesn't show up as a single loss. It shows up as erosion. Energy erodes, confidence erodes, self-trust erodes. You stop believing you'll ever choose. You tell yourself stories about being cautious or patient, but underneath something else grows. Resentment. Resentment toward circumstances. Resentment toward people who moved on. Resentment toward yourself. That resentment is the price of avoidance. Now let's talk about honesty. If you stripped away fear, guilt, and expectations, the decision would be obvious. Not easy, but obvious. You know which conversation you've avoided. You know which path you haven't committed to. You know which truth you've been softening. The fact that you recognize it is not a failure. It's an invitation. An invitation to stop pretending that confusion is the problem. The problem is courage, not dramatic courage, quiet courage, the courage to choose without guarantees, the courage to disappoint some people, the courage to accept that you waited longer than you needed to. Now let's talk about the moment after deciding. It's not fireworks, it's quiet. You feel exposed. You feel vulnerable. You wonder if you made a mistake. That's normal. That's what real decisions feel like. Confidence comes later. Peace comes later. First comes discomfort. People who never decide avoid that discomfort. People who decide pass through it. That's the difference. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how avoidance slowly becomes a lifestyle and why people don't even realize it's happening until years have passed. Chapter 5. How avoidance becomes a lifestyle. Avoidance rarely feels like avoidance. That's why it's so effective. If avoidance felt like fear or panic, most people would notice it immediately. They would recognize it as something to confront. Instead, avoidance feels reasonable. It feels like waiting. It feels like being careful. It feels like not wanting to rush into the wrong thing. Over time, those feelings stop being temporary strategies and start becoming a way of life. That's when avoidance becomes a lifestyle. It doesn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happens quietly through repetition. You delay one decision and nothing bad happens. So you delay another and another. Each delay reinforces the idea that waiting is safer than choosing. Soon, waiting feels natural. Now let's talk about how this shows up in everyday life. People who live in avoidance are often very busy. They fill their days with tasks, obligations, and responsibilities. Their calendars look full. Their lives look productive from the outside. But if you look closely, the busyness rarely points anywhere. It's maintenance. They maintain routines. They maintain appearances. They maintain stability. Maintenance is necessary, but maintenance alone doesn't move a life forward. People in avoidance mode often become excellent at coping. They learn how to tolerate dissatisfaction instead of resolving it. They learn how to manage stress rather than remove its source. They learn how to live with misalignment instead of addressing it. Coping becomes a skill. And like any skill, it improves with practice. The better you get at coping, the less urgent change feels. That's the danger. Now let's talk about identity again. Avoidance slowly reshapes how you see yourself. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who decides. You start thinking of yourself as someone who reacts. Life happens. Circumstances arise. You adapt. Adaptation feels mature. But when adaptation replaces intention, you lose authorship. You're no longer writing your life. You're editing around it. Now let's talk about how avoidance spreads. It rarely stays in one area. It might start with work, or a relationship, or a personal goal. But once avoidance becomes familiar, it migrates. You avoid conversations. You avoid commitments. You avoid clarity. You tell yourself you're flexible, but flexibility without direction becomes drift. Drift is comfortable at first. There's no pressure to be decisive, no pressure to be certain, no pressure to be wrong. But drift has a cost. Drift slowly removes friction from staying the same. Change starts to feel disruptive. Stability, even unhappy stability, feels preferable. Now let's talk about emotional numbing. When people live in avoidance long enough, something subtle happens. They stop feeling sharp dissatisfaction. Not because things improve, but because their emotional system adapts. They lower expectations. They dull desires. They stop imagining alternatives vividly. This numbing feels like peace, but it's not peace. It's resignation disguised as calm. True peace comes from alignment. Resignation comes from endurance. They feel similar on the surface, but they lead to very different lives. Now let's talk about the moment people sense something is wrong. It often happens during transitions. A birthday, a quiet night, seeing someone else move forward. There's a sudden awareness that time has passed. Not just days or months, years. And the realization hits quietly. I thought I'd be further by now. That thought doesn't come from comparison. It comes from memory. You remember who you thought you'd be. You remember the decisions you meant to make. You remember the direction you once felt strongly about. And you realize you're still standing near the same crossroads. That realization hurts. So people retreat back into busyness. They distract themselves. They tell themselves it's not the right time to think about this. Avoidance tightens its grip. Now let's talk about responsibility. People in avoidance mode often feel burdened. They feel like life is heavy. They carry responsibilities, but those responsibilities don't feel chosen. They feel imposed. This creates resentment. Resentment toward work, resentment toward relationships, resentment toward circumstances. But underneath that resentment is something quieter. Regret. Not dramatic regret, regret for the decisions that never happened, regret for the clarity that was ignored, regret for the courage that was postponed. Now let's talk about how avoidance justifies itself. Avoidance uses language. It says things like, I can't right now. It's complicated. I have too much going on. Later will be better. Those statements may be true in isolation, but when they become permanent, they lose their honesty. Later becomes indefinite. Indefinite becomes never. Now let's talk about the cost you don't see while you're paying it. Avoidance costs self-trust. Each time you delay a decision you know you should face, you teach yourself something. You teach yourself that you don't follow through on your own awareness. That lesson accumulates. Over time, you stop trusting your instincts. You stop believing your clarity matters. You become hesitant even when the answer is obvious. That's not because you're incapable, it's because you've practiced avoidance. Now let's talk about breaking the lifestyle. Breaking avoidance does not start with a dramatic leap. It starts with one honest admission. I know what I've been avoiding. Naming it changes everything. It takes the problem out of the abstract. It removes the fog. You don't have to act immediately, but you do have to stop pretending you don't know. That's the beginning of authorship. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the quiet cost of waiting and how waiting feels harmless while it's quietly reshaping your life. Chapter 6. The quiet cost of waiting. Waiting feels harmless. It doesn't feel like a mistake. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like nothing. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because while you're waiting, life continues. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Days pass without consequence. Weeks blur together. Months fade into memory. Nothing bad happens right away. So you assume nothing bad is happening at all. But waiting has a cost. It just charges slowly. Now let's talk about what waiting actually costs you. It costs momentum. Momentum isn't just about action, it's about belief. Belief that your actions matter. Belief that change is possible. Belief that choosing leads somewhere better. When you wait too long, belief weakens. You stop expecting things to change. Not because you don't want them to, because you've trained yourself not to hope. Hope feels dangerous when nothing moves. Now let's talk about energy. Waiting drains energy in a way that's hard to notice. You're not exhausted from effort. You're tired from restraint. Holding yourself back requires energy. Suppressing decisions requires energy. Living with unresolved tension requires energy. That energy drain shows up as fatigue. People think they're tired because life is busy. Often, they're tired because they're carrying a decision they won't make. Now let's talk about identity again. Waiting shapes identity. You start seeing yourself as someone in transition, not who you were, not who you're becoming, just in between. That in-between state feels temporary, but when waiting lasts too long, it becomes permanent. You live in a constant state of almost. Almost starting, almost deciding, almost changing. Almost is comfortable. Almost doesn't demand commitment. Almost keeps hope alive without risk. But almost never turns into enough on its own. Now let's talk about time perception. Waiting distorts time. The future feels far away. The past feels recent. Years feel like they've gone by quickly, even though each day felt slow. This distortion is unsettling. People wake up one day and feel like time accelerated. It didn't. It was just unmarked. Decisions mark time. Waiting lets it slip by unnoticed. Now let's talk about regret. Regret rarely arrives as a dramatic realization. It arrives as a quiet sadness, a sense that something was missed, a sense that life is narrower than it could have been. People often regret what they didn't choose more than what they did, because unchosen paths never get resolved. They linger as questions. What if? What would have happened if I had chosen then? Those questions don't bring answers. They bring restlessness. Now let's talk about responsibility. Waiting shifts responsibility outward. You tell yourself you're waiting for circumstances to change, for more time, for more money, for less risk. But waiting for perfect conditions means surrendering agency. You place your life in the hands of events. Events don't care about your intentions. They just happen. People who wait often feel like life is happening to them, not because it is, but because they gave it permission. Now let's talk about the emotional cost of waiting. Waiting dulls urgency. Urgency isn't panic. It's aliveness. It's the feeling that choices matter. When urgency fades, days feel interchangeable. Routine replaces intention. Comfort replaces growth. You don't feel miserable. You feel flat. Flatness is harder to confront than pain. Pain demands attention. Flatness invites endurance. People can endure flatness for decades. Now let's talk about honesty again. If waiting truly served you, you would feel lighter. You would feel clearer. You would feel more at peace. If waiting has lasted a long time and you feel heavier, more restless, or quietly dissatisfied, that's information. Waiting isn't neutral, it's shaping you. Now let's talk about the illusion of preparation. People say they're waiting to be ready, but readiness doesn't come from waiting, it comes from engagement. You don't become ready by thinking, you become ready by moving, even imperfectly. Waiting delays readiness. Action creates it. Now let's talk about the point of no return. This isn't meant to scare you. There isn't a single deadline where life ends. But there are windows. Windows of energy. Windows of flexibility. Windows of possibility. Waiting closes windows quietly. Not all at once. One by one. People often don't notice until the view has narrowed. Now let's talk about the truth people avoid. Waiting feels safer than choosing. But safety without direction leads to stagnation. Stagnation feels peaceful until it feels suffocating. By the time it feels suffocating, change feels harder than it needed to be. Now let's talk about the moment waiting ends. Waiting ends the moment you decide to stop calling avoidance patience. That moment doesn't require action yet. It requires honesty. Honesty changes the question. You stop asking, when will things change? You start asking, what am I willing to choose now, even imperfectly? That question restores agency. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about why choosing feels like losing at first, and why that feeling is actually a sign you're on the right path. Chapter 7. Why choosing feels like losing at first. When you finally choose, something unexpected happens. You don't feel relief, you feel loss. That surprises people. They expect clarity to feel empowering. They expect confidence. They expect certainty to arrive the moment they decide. Instead, what arrives first is discomfort, grief even. This is where many people panic and assume they made the wrong choice. They didn't. They just weren't prepared for what choosing actually costs. Every real decision removes options, and the human mind is deeply attached to possibility. Possibility feels hopeful. Possibility feels safe. Possibility feels like freedom. But possibility is not progress. Progress requires narrowing. The moment you choose, all the futures you didn't pick disappear. Not slowly, immediately. And even if those futures were unlikely, even if they were unrealistic, even if they were never truly aligned, losing them still hurts. That pain is real. It doesn't mean you chose wrong. It means you chose honestly. Now let's talk about why this feeling is so intense. The brain interprets loss more strongly than gain. This is not a character flaw. It's wiring. You can gain something valuable and still feel worse temporarily because what you lost registers louder than what you gained. Choosing a direction means losing alternatives. The brain focuses on what closed, not what opened. This is why choosing feels like losing at first. People who aren't prepared for this interpret the feeling as a warning. They think, this doesn't feel right. So they reopen the door, they renegotiate the decision, they soften the commitment, they tell themselves they can still keep other options just in case. That brings relief, but it also brings stagnation back. Now let's talk about identity again. Choosing changes who you are, not immediately, but irreversibly. Once you decide, you can't fully return to the old version of yourself. Even if you go back to old habits, something inside you knows. You crossed a line. You saw yourself choose. That awareness removes innocence. And losing innocence is uncomfortable. Before you could say, I haven't decided yet. After choosing, you can't say that anymore. You're responsible now. Responsibility feels heavy before it feels freeing. Now let's talk about why people romanticize certainty. People believe that confident people feel good when they decide. They don't. They feel exposed. Certainty doesn't eliminate doubt. It changes your relationship with it. You stop waiting for doubt to disappear. You move with it present. That takes practice. Now let's talk about comparison. Right after choosing, people often look around and compare. They notice others who seem more established, more certain, more successful. That comparison hurts more at this stage because your old identity's gone and your new one isn't solid yet. You feel unanchored. That's normal. You're between identities. Most people quit here. They retreat to what's familiar. They say things like, maybe I moved too fast, or I should have waited longer. Waiting would not have made this part easier. It only would have delayed it. Now let's talk about the false belief that good decisions feel good. Good decisions often feel neutral at best and uncomfortable at worst in the beginning. They feel good later, after consistency, after adjustment, after your nervous system adapts. Expecting immediate emotional reward is one of the biggest reasons people abandon good choices. Now let's talk about what staying looks like. Staying doesn't mean forcing enthusiasm. It means allowing discomfort without reacting to it. It means not reopening closed doors just to relieve anxiety. It means letting the grief run its course. Yes, grief. Grief for who you thought you might be. Grief for the easier path. Grief for the fantasy that you could have everything without choosing. That grief is part of growth. Avoiding it keeps you small. Now let's talk about trust. Choosing requires trust in a future you can't see yet. That trust isn't blind, it's built from alignment. Does this decision move you closer to honesty? Does it reduce internal conflict? Does it simplify your life, even if it makes it harder temporarily? Those are better signals than comfort. Now let's talk about permanence. People fear that choosing locks them in forever. It doesn't. But it does lock you in long enough to change. That's the part people resist. They want the option to leave before transformation occurs. But transformation requires time inside commitment. Leaving early keeps everything theoretical. Now let's talk about relief. Relief doesn't come from choosing. It comes from staying chosen. It comes when the new path starts to feel familiar, when routines stabilize, when effort decreases, when identity catches up to action. That relief is calm, not exciting, but it's real and it lasts. Now let's talk about the people who made it through this phase. They didn't feel braver than you. They didn't feel more confident. They just didn't undo the decision when discomfort showed up. They stayed. That's it. Staying is the difference between a life that moves forward and one that keeps resetting. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what actually happens after you decide. Once the noise settles and life begins to reorganize around your choice. Chapter 8. What actually happens after you decide. After you decide, life does not immediately improve. That surprises people. They expect momentum to appear. They expect clarity to sharpen. They expect the weight to lift. Instead, things often feel strangely quiet, not peaceful, not exciting, just quieter. That quiet can feel unsettling. You are used to thinking, planning, revisiting, questioning. Decision-making filled a lot of mental space. Once the decision is made, that space empties. And emptiness can feel like something is missing, but what's missing is noise. Now let's talk about what really changes after you decide. The first thing that changes is internal friction. Before deciding, every small action required negotiation. Should I do this? Is this the right direction? What if I change my mind? After deciding, those questions lose relevance. You don't answer them anymore, you move. Movement feels simpler, not easier, but simpler. Now let's talk about resistance. Resistance doesn't disappear after deciding. It just becomes clearer. Before, resistance hid inside indecision. After, it shows up as effort. Effort is easier to work with than indecision. You can schedule effort. You can manage effort. You can recover from effort. Indecision drains you without producing anything. Effort produces something, even if it's imperfect. Now let's talk about your environment. After you decide, your environment starts responding. Not dramatically, subtly. Certain people drift away. Certain conversations stop happening. Certain expectations dissolve. This can feel lonely at first, but it's also a sign that your life is reorganizing. Alignment repels what doesn't fit. That repulsion can feel like loss before it feels like relief. Now let's talk about doubt. Doubt doesn't vanish after deciding, it just loses control. Doubt becomes background noise instead of the driver. You hear it, but you don't obey it. That shift is subtle but powerful. Most people think confidence eliminates doubt. It doesn't. Confidence means doubt no longer dictates behavior. Now let's talk about pace. After deciding, people often try to move too fast. They want to make up for lost time. They push hard. They overload themselves. This is understandable, but unnecessary. Speed is not the goal. Stability is. Stability allows consistency. Consistency changes identity. Identity produces results. Now let's talk about boredom again. After the initial adjustment, things can feel boring. Routine replaces anticipation. Repetition replaces novelty. This boredom is often mistaken for misalignment. It's not, it's normalization. Normalization is what allows change to last. The life you want eventually becomes ordinary. That ordinariness is the reward. Now let's talk about progress. Progress after deciding is uneven. Some days feel good, some days feel flat, some days feel frustrating. This is normal. Progress is not linear, but it is directional. The key difference is that setbacks no longer reset you. They're absorbed. You adjust and continue. Now let's talk about self-trust. After deciding, self-trust begins rebuilding. Not because everything works, but because you stop abandoning yourself. Each day you stay with the decision, even imperfectly, you send yourself a signal. I follow through. That signal compounds. Eventually you stop questioning whether you'll stay. You just do. Now let's talk about clarity. Clarity doesn't arrive as a revelation. It emerges gradually. You understand things you couldn't see before. You notice patterns. You recognize what matters and what doesn't. Clarity follows commitment. It does not precede it. Now let's talk about the feeling people chase. People chase excitement. What they actually want is calm. Calm comes when your actions align with your values. When you're no longer split internally. That calm is subtle, but it changes everything. You sleep better. You think more clearly. You feel less rushed. Life feels less like something you're trying to escape. Now let's talk about the truth people don't say out loud. Deciding doesn't solve all your problems, but it makes them honest. You stop fighting imaginary futures. You deal with the life you're building. Honesty is grounding. Grounding creates peace. Now let's talk about continuation. The real work after deciding is not pushing, it's staying. Staying when it's boring. Staying when it's uncomfortable. Staying when no one is watching. That's how decisions turn into direction. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about living with fewer options and more peace, and why limitation is often the thing people are actually seeking. Chapter 9, Living with Fewer Options and More Peace. At first, fewer options feel like loss. You notice what you no longer consider. You notice the paths you stopped entertaining. You notice the conversations you don't have anymore. That narrowing can feel restrictive. But over time, something unexpected happens. Your mind gets quieter. You're no longer constantly evaluating alternatives. You're no longer scanning for exits. You're no longer holding your life half open, just in case. That openness used to feel like freedom. Now it feels like noise. Fewer options don't shrink your life. They focus it. Focus is calming. Now let's talk about why the mind craves options in the first place. Options create the illusion of safety. If something goes wrong, you can leave. If things get hard, you can pivot. If you feel doubt, you can retreat. Options protect you from commitment, but they also prevent depth. Depth only forms when you stay. When you remove excess options, you give your nervous system permission to settle. You stop bracing for change. You stop preparing to escape. You begin to inhabit your life instead of hovering over it. That inhabiting creates peace. Now let's talk about peace because it's often misunderstood. Peace is not excitement. Peace is not constant happiness. Peace is the absence of internal conflict. It's the feeling that you're no longer arguing with yourself all day. When options narrow, that argument quiets. You stop asking, what if? What else? Maybe later? You start asking, what's next? What matters? What's mine to do today? Those questions are simpler. They're easier to answer. Now let's talk about attention. When options are endless, attention scatters. You're always partially elsewhere, thinking about other lives, other possibilities, other versions of yourself. That scattered attention creates dissatisfaction. Even when things are good, they don't feel complete. With fewer options, attention gathers. You're more present. You notice details you used to miss. You listen more fully. You engage more deeply. You experience moments instead of evaluating them. Presence is deeply satisfying. Now let's talk about the fear people have. They fear that choosing fewer options means settling. But settling is not about limitation. Settling is about alignment. Settling happens when you commit to something that doesn't match who you are. Peace happens when you commit to something that does. Limitation reveals alignment. It strips away distraction. Now let's talk about responsibility again. With fewer options, responsibility becomes clear. You stop blaming circumstances. You stop waiting for external changes. You work with what you chose. That responsibility can feel heavy at first, but it's also empowering. You regain authorship. Your life stops feeling accidental. Now let's talk about comparison. When options were open, comparison was constant. You compared your life to lives you weren't living. You imagined how things could have been. That comparison fueled restlessness. With fewer options, comparison fades. You're no longer measuring your life against imagined alternatives. You're living inside a chosen reality. That reality feels real. Now let's talk about stability. Stability doesn't mean stagnation. It means your foundation is solid. From that foundation, growth becomes sustainable. You can take risks because you're grounded. You can adapt because you're not drifting. Stability creates freedom of a different kind. Not freedom to escape, freedom to build. Now let's talk about time again. When options narrow, time feels fuller. Days feel more distinct. Moments feel more intentional. You stop losing time to indecision. You use it. That alone changes your relationship with life. Now let's talk about the quiet joy people don't expect. When you stop holding everything open, gratitude emerges. Not forced gratitude, natural gratitude. You appreciate what you have because you're no longer fantasizing about what you don't. That appreciation deepens experience. Now let's talk about maintenance again. Life still requires effort. You still have challenges. But the effort feels meaningful. You're maintaining something you chose. That makes a difference. Now let's talk about the end of this chapter. Living with fewer options is not a limitation. It's a refinement. It's the process of removing what doesn't belong so what does can take root. Peace doesn't come from having every door open. It comes from walking through one door fully. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about why most people never choose and what keeps them circling the same crossroads for most of their lives. Chapter 10. Why most people never choose. Most people don't refuse to choose. They just never arrive at the moment where choosing feels unavoidable. They live their entire lives in the space just before decision. That space feels active. It feels thoughtful. It feels responsible. But it is also where time disappears. The reason most people never choose is not lack of courage. It's lack of friction. Nothing forces the decision. Life remains tolerable. Not good enough to feel fulfilled. Not bad enough to demand change. Just tolerable enough to endure. That middle ground is where dreams go quiet. Now let's talk about why tolerable lives are dangerous. When life is unbearable, people change. When life is joyful, people commit. But when life is tolerable, people drift. Tolerable becomes the enemy of growth. People tell themselves, it's not that bad. I can handle this. Others have it worse. Those statements are true, and they are also traps. They lower the standard for action. Now let's talk about responsibility again. Choosing means accepting responsibility for direction, not just outcomes. Direction. Most people are comfortable taking responsibility for effort. They'll work hard. They'll stay busy. They'll sacrifice. But direction feels heavier. Direction means saying, this is where I'm going. If it doesn't work, you own that. That level of ownership is uncomfortable. So people stay busy without aiming. Now let's talk about fear in its quietest form. The fear isn't failing publicly. It's succeeding privately. If you choose and follow through, you'll have no one to blame if you're still unhappy. That truth is heavier than people admit. Avoidance keeps blame external. Choice makes it internal. Now let's talk about stories people tell themselves. They say, I'll know when it's time. I just need more clarity. I'm waiting for the right opportunity. Those stories keep the door open. But clarity doesn't arrive without movement. Opportunity follows commitment. Time does not announce itself. It passes. Now let's talk about habit. Indecision becomes habitual. The longer you delay choosing, the more foreign choosing feels. Your nervous system adapts to hesitation. Action feels risky. Staying still feels safe. This is why people say things like, I don't recognize myself anymore. They do. They've just practiced avoidance longer than intention. Now let's talk about the cost most people never calculate. The cost of never choosing is not failure. It's diminishment. You become smaller, not visibly, internally. You stop imagining boldly. You stop desiring deeply. You stop expecting alignment. Life becomes something you manage instead of something you live. Now let's talk about the moment that breaks this pattern. For some people, it's a crisis. For others, it's a quiet realization. A moment where they see clearly that waiting hasn't protected them. It's only delayed living. That realization doesn't always lead to action, but it creates a crack, and cracks let light in. Now let's talk about you. If you're listening to this, something in you is already awake. You're not numb. You're not disengaged. You're aware enough to feel the tension. That awareness matters. But awareness without action becomes frustration. The point of this book is not to pressure you. It's to remove the illusion that confusion is the problem. The problem is postponed courage. In the next chapter, the bonus chapter, we're going to slow everything down. We're going to talk about the day you stop lying to yourself and what actually changes when honesty replaces avoidance. Bonus chapter, sir. The day you stop lying to yourself. There is a day that doesn't look important when it happens. Nothing dramatic occurs. No announcement is made. No one else notices. But something changes quietly. It's the day you stop lying to yourself. Not in a harsh way, in a tired way. You don't expose yourself out of courage. You do it because pretending has become exhausting. The lies you stop telling are small. I'm just thinking things through. I'll deal with it later. It's not the right time yet. They're not malicious lies. They're protective ones. They exist to keep you comfortable. But comfort has a cost, and eventually that cost becomes heavier than the truth. The day you stop lying to yourself doesn't feel empowering. It feels sobering. You see things clearly, not optimistically, honestly. You see where you are. You see what hasn't changed. You see what you've been avoiding. And for the first time, you don't soften it. You don't add excuses. You don't tell a nicer story. You just let it be what it is. That moment can feel lonely, because for a long time, the stories helped. They kept hope alive without forcing action. Letting go of them feels like losing a shield, but it's also the moment real movement becomes possible. Now let's talk about what honesty actually does. Honesty removes fog, not instantly, but steadily. When you stop lying to yourself, decisions become simpler, not easier, but clearer. You stop pretending you don't know. You stop asking questions you already answered. You stop waiting for permission. You accept that the discomfort you feel is not confusion. It's resistance. Resistance to change. Resistance to loss. Resistance to responsibility. Seeing that doesn't mean you act immediately, but it changes your posture. You're no longer hiding from yourself. Now let's talk about how people usually imagine this moment. They think it comes with resolve, with confidence, with determination. It usually doesn't. It comes with resignation. A quiet acceptance that waiting has not protected you, that staying open has not kept you safe, that delaying has not made things easier. This acceptance is not defeat. It's clarity without illusion, and clarity is powerful. Now let's talk about the fear that comes next. Once you stop lying to yourself, you can't unsee what you've seen. You can't go back to pretending the decision isn't there. That awareness creates pressure, but it's not the pressure to act immediately. It's the pressure to stop pretending you don't know. From this point on, every delay is conscious. That changes everything. Now let's talk about the small shift that happens next. You stop asking, what should I do? You start asking, what am I willing to live with? That question is different. It's grounded. It doesn't ask for perfect answers. It asks for honesty. You may not be ready to change everything, but you may be ready to admit what you can no longer tolerate. That admission is enough to begin. Now let's talk about action. Action after honesty is different from forced action. It's quieter, more deliberate, less dramatic. You don't announce it. You don't rush it. You don't make promises. You take one step that aligns with what you admitted. That step might be small, a conversation you stop avoiding, a boundary you finally set, a routine you stop pretending is temporary. These steps don't feel heroic. They feel grounding. Now let's talk about relief. Relief doesn't come from fixing everything. It comes from congruence, from your inner awareness matching your outer behavior. When you stop lying to yourself, the internal split closes. You're no longer acting one way while knowing another. That alignment creates calm, not happiness, calm. Now let's talk about staying honest. Honesty is not a one-time event, it's a practice. You'll feel the pull to soften things again, to delay again, to reopen options again. That's normal. The difference now is awareness. You notice when you're doing it, and that noticing gives you choice. Now let's talk about self-respect. Self-respect grows when your actions align with what you know. Not when everything works out, not when you feel confident, but when you stop abandoning yourself. That self-respect is quiet, but it's sturdy. Now let's talk about time one last time. Time feels different after honesty. It feels more valuable, not rushed, but intentional. You stop killing time. You stop waiting it out. You start using it deliberately, even when progress is slow. Now let's talk about the end of this book. There is no dramatic conclusion, no final push, no call to transform your life overnight. That would contradict everything you've heard. This book is not about urgency. It's about authorship, about recognizing that confusion was never the problem. Avoidance was. And avoidance loses its power the moment you stop lying to yourself about it. You don't need to force change. You need to stop pretending you don't know what's being asked of you. That's enough. Everything else unfolds from there.